Sociopolitical changes are not made by word gibberish but by elite rearrangement. Identify counterelites and raise them up. In Russian case it would be regional elites and cops. Give them salt. Cops as the true and only revolutionary class. I see two scenarios for the Russian Federation, positive and negative. Positive scenario would be the West maximizing systemic shock on Russian economy. Its paralysis and following collapse will give the West leverage for negotiations. Thread: negotiations shouldn't be held with Putin. That's insane. He ain't stupid and knows there's no way back. They shouldn't be held with Russian people. The idea of them rising up to overthrow Putin is even crazier. That's a Protestant moral crusade disguised as the policy making. Negotiations shouldn't be held with the army. Russian army is emasculated. It's low in dominance hierarchy, has zero respect, autonomy or capacity for decision-making. Every regime since 1917 aimed to castrate the army so it wouldn't be a threat. Putin did it most successfully. Negotiations should be held with 1. Mid-ranked elites, primarily regional. 2. The cops, the true revolutionary force in Russia, and workers, students, or army. It's the cops. Russia is a state security regime and cops are lower-ranked security forces equals counter-elite. I want to reiterate this point. It's absurd to think that a revolution can be done by the oppressed. Truly oppressed can't do a revolution, because they can't do anything. They can't even launch a proper revolt. They can raise only a food riot which will be easily routed. That was a major problem for Soviet historiography. Soviets regarded Muscovy and Russian Empire as feudal regimes. In feudal regime, feudals are the oppressors and peasants are the oppressed. Thus in a Marxist worldview, peasants would pose the major revolutionary threat there. Indeed, Russia had two gigantic rebellions in 1667, 1671 and 1773 to 1775. Based on their Marxist paradigm, Soviets labeled them as peasants' rebellions, which was highly inaccurate. Both largest rebellions in Russian history were led by Cossacks, Stepan Razin and Gemelyan Pugachev. In both cases the fighting force and leadership was comprised of Cossacks, who weren't the oppressed but a counter-elite, challenging the rule of Russian nobility. They were aided by steppe nomads, dispossessed Muslim and Finnic nobility, religious dissidents, old believers, etc. Serfs helped the rebels by attacking their masters, officials, infrastructure and inflicting general chaos. But they were too disorganized and untrained to pose military threat to the regime rather than creating a fog of war. Serfs were more like a smokescreen for Cossack troops. If we look at outsiders, non-Cossacks, who made it to the core of rebellions, we can see a pattern. What remained of Razin's army was led by a Mordvimir Galeev. He was a Volga Fin holding a Turkic title. Volga Finns were heavily Turkified like Baltic Finns Germanized. The largest non-Cossack force participating in Pugachev's revolt were Bashkirs led by Salavatchulev. His family used to be privileged. They were large landowners relieved from tax, Tarkhans, canton commanders, but then their land was confiscated for a factory, so they rebelled. So the pattern of largest Russian rebellions was the following. It was an alliance between the 1. Military paramilitary counter-elite. 2. Pressured and dispossessed regional elites. The latter had authority and commanded obedience in province but had grudge against the government. I also find it very interesting that both largest rebellions in Russian history were not only raised by Cossacks, but by Cossacks from the exactly same village, Stanitsa, Zamovayskaya, now Pugachevskaya. This isn't an accident. That's the power of mythos and why memory matters. The very fact that you know that a certain guy from your village once raised an enormous rebellion and almost made it, will encourage other boys from that place to try again. Give them a sort of permission. Power of permission is wildly underestimated when we discuss great families that produced a number of geniuses. It's not only about genes, wealth or network, it's also about permission. The fact that people from your reference group did something great encourages you to try too. To accomplish something you need first to try. And to try you need to be relatively high in spirit. That's why an effective way to make sure people will never even try is to keep them low in spirit. Russian government knows it and used this trick to emasculate the Russian army. The more high in spirit the army is, the more inner political threat it poses. Thus the government will make every effort to keep them low in spirit. Watch this video with TV host yelling at an officer for suggesting to have a minute of silence for soldiers killed in Ukraine.
То, что здесь многие люди с боевым опытом и через Афганистан прошли, и через чеченскую кампанию прошли, и через Донбасс. Там реально наши ребята, и донецкие, и луганские, и наши силы спецопераций гибнут сейчас. И наша страна, она...
Не-не-не-не-не-не!
Нет,
я не хочу это слышать. Подождите. Нет,
послушайте,
стойте.
Они гибнут все равно.
Стойте.
Они все равно
да
гибнут.
Остановитесь.
Подождите секунду.
Вы не можете остановиться,
Я просто хочу, чтобы мы сейчас встали и почтили память молчанием, хотя бы минутой молчания наших ребят, которые там все равно сражаются за Россию и за Донбасс.
Вы можете сейчас остановиться? Пожалуйста. Я вам сейчас скажу, что там наши ребята делают. Наши ребята там разят гадину
это
фашистскую.
Правильно, но
это
правильно
да
все.
Дайте мне договорить.
Да.
Это триумф русского оружия, это триумф русской армии, это возрождение России.
Russian soldiers are forced into gay prostitution. According to an international gay guide Spartacus, you can either pick up a soldier in Moscow city center or visit a nearby military base and choose the one you like for $100–500 US. That's how officers are hustling. Typical story. Conscript Ilya was forced into prostitution on his second month of service. He got a letter from his GF and didn't give it to Sergeant to read. Angry Sergeant told Ilya won't need girls anymore. That evening he was gang raped. Later, they would sell him to clients. Everyone fears glorious Russian army, and yet, Russian organized crime considers it as prey. Thieves literally visit military bases with nuclear rockets, Syrian war veterans and racketeer them. Officers and men pay, of course. Thief is higher than a soldier in dominance hierarchy. Westerners find stories with mafia racketeering the army incredible, impossible to believe in. They sound too absurd and remind Anglos of a Monty Python sketch. The very idea of mafia racketeering the army, including war veterans, and army paying sounds unnatural, because it is. Incredibly low status of Russian army isn't natural. That's a deliberate plan to keep them low in spirit. If their status rises, they would become a counter-elite, and army is a very dangerous counter-elite. Russian rulers would prefer not to have, so they eliminate this threat. Of course any elite would prefer not to have counter-elite at all, but that's impossible. If you eliminate any outer rivals, it just means you'll get a counter-elite within your regime. Communist Party destroyed any rivals in the USSR. That's why KGB turned into the counter-elite. Putin's FSB regime worked hard on eliminating any outer threat in the country. They destroyed or subjugated all other forces in Russia, political parties, oligarchs, governors, etc. As a result, Russian state security regime is unchallenged from outside. There's no one left. Thus it will be challenged from inside. The problem is that Russian state security is not homogeneous. There are many security forces within it and their status is highly unequal. Broadly speaking, FSB is higher nobility while cops are lower nobility. Elite and counter-elite. That's extremely important. The factor of status competition within the elite and within the regime is wildly underrated. And yet, this may be the main force of literally any social and political changes. To change STH you need to harness elite forces by giving them incentives. That's exactly what Putin did. Back in 1990s FSB used to be the lower nobility. Its status, salaries, privileges were far below other security agencies, SVR, FSO, FAPSI and of course the true aristocracy, the Presidential Security Service led by Kozhakov, the top civic of the era. When Putin was appointed an FSB director, he was unknown, not very much respected chief of a lower status security structure. Even his own officers didn't hold him in high regard. He knew it. To renegotiate the balance of power he needed to renegotiate the elite hierarchy. That's why he immediately started raising the FSB status. He raised its salaries, its benefits, its privileges to SVR and FSO level. He knew the FSB wants to rise and he needed to harness this natural force for his own benefit. He gave them salt. Putin harnessed the FSB urge to rise and raised them. Other security agencies were either subjugated or dissolved completely like FAPSI. Lower nobility became higher nobility, and that was the main driver of Putin's power consolidation, not the gibberish about national revival. Intellectuals focus too much on discourse. Great Russia, orthodoxy, democracy, Western values. That's not wrong, but I would suggest other way to look at it. How would you renegotiate the power balance? Which counterelite forces will you harness to make a change? Words are great, but honestly neurotypical PPL don't care about words, only autists do. Normal healthy people just do whatever they like and find convenient and then rationalize. Make up a justification why this was the only right moral choice to make. They can be very creative. Rule of thumb: lower nobility hates higher nobility. They aren't dumb and won't tell it publicly, but privately. In between, that's the main topic of their conversation when higher nobility isn't around. Lower nobility wants to become higher nobility, eliminating the higher-ups. Don't think as an ideologue, think like an entrepreneur. According to Schumpeter, innovation is either employment of new factors of production or a new combination of existing ones. You can't create a new order from your head as Brahma. You must rearrange the existing one. Don't use the God mindset, use a startup mindset. How can we rearrange existing Russian order? Which already existing political factors can we employ, or how can we rearrange employed ones? That would make a socio-political innovation, and ideological gibberish won't. My advice: negotiate with the lower nobility which has direct power and is somewhat high in spirit. That includes 1. Mid-ranked, primarily regional elites. 2. Cops, give them salt. End of thread.